Climbing up into one of these caves near the shoreline of the Dead Sea, you can see how these caves were perfect places to hide these.
It started with a sealed scroll buried in silence for over 2,000 years, found deep in a cave in northern Israel.
The existing understanding of the Christian texts at least 100 years.
At first, it looked like just another fragment from the past, but then scientists translated it and realized what they were holding: a letter, allegedly written by Jesus himself.
It really is as important as that. I mean, it's arguably one of the most important.
Not a sermon, not a parable, a quiet, personal message to his brother James. When the story broke, Joe Rogan picked it up live on air. His reaction? Pure disbelief. And what followed stunned even his most skeptical guests. Because this letter doesn't try to rewrite the Bible, it reveals something else entirely. A side of Jesus few have ever imagined. Private, reflective, maybe even afraid. And if the experts are right, the world may have just heard the one voice it was never meant to hear until now. The letter that shouldn't exist. In the spring of 2023, a team of archaeologists surveying a little explored cave system near Mount Arbel in northern Israel made a find they almost overlooked. Tucked inside a small alcove, wrapped in layers of cloth and sealed in what appeared to be hardened resin or wax, was an object no one expected: a compact scroll, surprisingly intact. At first glance, it looked like any number of ancient religious manuscripts scattered across the region. Small, fragile, likely tied to one of the many early Christian or Essene communities that flourished in the area during the 1st century. Discoveries like this are rare, but not unheard of. But this scroll had something different that caused the team to pause. The material was unusually well preserved. The script, once cleaned and gently unrolled in a controlled environment, revealed lines of Aramaic, the everyday language spoken in Judea during the early 1st century. Not Greek, not Latin, Aramaic, and that choice of language alone hinted at a deeply personal tone, not something meant for public teaching or wide distribution. The real shock came when preliminary translation began. What they found wasn't a copied gospel. It wasn't a declaration to followers or even a formal theological treatise. It was, for all intents and purposes, a private letter addressed not to a congregation, but to a single person. The name stood out in the opening line: Yaakov, in modern English, James. Specifically, scholars believe James the Just, commonly understood to be the brother of Jesus. Naturally, the first question that came up was authorship. Who wrote it? The language was intimate. The phrasing was unlike the more stylized verses of the New Testament. It referenced no miracles, no sermons on hills, no great prophecies. It spoke instead of exhaustion, of inner conflict, of preparing for something that couldn't be stopped. The writer described a heavy burden, a desire for clarity, and a parting of ways with those who speak my name but do not hear me. It was emotional, raw, human. What stunned many of the scholars involved wasn't just the tone, it was the consistency. The phrasing, the dialect, the context all matched what we might expect from someone writing privately in early 1st century Galilee. Carbon dating of the parchment and ink confirmed the scroll likely dates between 30 and 50 AD. That places it directly in the time frame when Jesus and James were both alive. But here's the problem. There's no historical record, biblical or otherwise, of Jesus writing anything down. He's described in the Gospels as a speaker, a teacher, someone who shared wisdom aloud. His words were carried by others, remembered, reshaped, and eventually written down by followers like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But this, a letter in his own handwriting to his brother, if genuine, it rewrites more than religious tradition. It reframes Jesus not just as a figure of divine wisdom, but as a man aware of what was coming, someone choosing to say something in private, something not meant for the crowds. Naturally, scholars are divided. Some argue it's a forgery, a well-crafted one, but still a fabrication. Others insist the detail.
They are denying that Jesus had a physical body. He only seemed to have a physical body. And they wrote documents later on. So the Gospel of Peter, which comes around in, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries.
The ink composition and the sealing method are too precise to fake without modern tools. No forger from antiquity would have had that kind of foresight. And there's the deeper question, if Jesus did write even one letter, why wasn't it known until now? Was it hidden on purpose, lost in the shuffle of early persecution, or was it simply meant for James alone and never meant to be seen by anyone else? No matter which way the academic debate leans, the fact remains, this scroll shouldn't exist. Not according to any doctrine, not according to history, not according to what we thought we knew about Jesus, but it does.
Like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
And now the world is left with a mystery far older than any theory, a message from the past, written in silence, waiting 2 millennia to be heard. What the message actually says. If the discovery left historians and theologians stunned by the existence of the letter, then its contents stirred something even deeper, a quiet sense of disruption. Because what lay written inside wasn't a grand revelation, it wasn't a prophecy, and it wasn't designed to be preached from any pulpit. It was personal, carefully translated by a small group of linguistic scholars and theologians. The letter, still only partially released to the public, reads more like a confession than a proclamation. Written in first person, with simple phrasing and a tone of quiet urgency, the voice doesn't command it. It doesn't quote scripture, it wrestles with the weight of belief. According to early interpretations, the letter opens with a moment of silence, literally. The first few lines, roughly translated, read, "Let what is loud grow still, and let what is seen be known for what it hides." Already, there's a sense that this isn't a message meant for public teaching. It's about something quieter, something harder to explain out loud. From there, the letter shifts into a theme that scholars say repeats gently throughout the text: truth as burden. One of the most striking lines reads, "The truth is not for the crowd. The truth must be carried, and not all hands are made for its weight." It's not accusatory, it's not bitter, but there's clearly a tension being expressed, perhaps between what Jesus believed internally and how that message might eventually be reshaped, misunderstood, or even misused by others after he was gone. Nowhere in the letter does he refer to kings or empires. There's no mention of Rome, no veiled threats, no political undertones. This isn't a revolutionary manifesto. It reads like a final journal entry, a way to pass something along to someone he trusted completely. James, referred to here simply as "my brother in soul and blood," seems to be the intended carrier of something deeply fragile. In one part of the letter, the writer reflects on the loneliness of being misunderstood, even by those who followed him. He writes, "They see only the fire, but not the hand that lit it. They repeat my words, but do not wait to hear them." To some readers, it suggests that Jesus foresaw the way his teachings might one day be taken out of context, used more for identity than insight. But perhaps the most mysterious line, the one that has been quoted most in the media, sits quietly near the end. For historians, it's an unusual thing to say in a document that could have been an instruction or a doctrine. But instead of outlining a moral code or theology, the writer simply points toward the idea that spiritual understanding must be lived, not recorded. Forgiveness appears again and again. But it's not about sin, it's about misinterpretation. There's even a passage where he says, "Forgive those who use my name too quickly. They are not thieves, they are hungry." It's an acknowledgement that people will get things wrong, but often out of longing, not deception. There's no mention of miracles, no discussion of crucifixion, no foreshadowing of the resurrection. That silence has puzzled many, but others suggest it's deliberate. This letter isn't about proving anything, it's about passing something invisible from one brother to another, something more emotional than intellectual. So, what is the message really? Not a doctrine, not a warning, not a secret revealed. It's humility. It's the ache of someone who sees what's coming, not just death, but the transformation of everything he stood for, and wants someone close to understand, just once, before it all changes. For many who have studied it, the real shock isn't the content itself, it's how quiet it is, how stripped down. In a world still fighting over what Jesus meant, here is a document that doesn't argue. It reflects. It breathes. And for some, that's the most powerful thing of all. Why this hit Joe Rogan so hard? On a recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, the conversation took a turn no one quite expected. The guest, an academic historian who specialized in early Christianity, casually mentioned something that made Joe lean all the way in. Wait, Jesus wrote a letter? Joe asked, blinking in disbelief. No one ever told me that was even possible. You could feel the shift in tone. The energy changed, not in a sensational or over-the-top way, but in the kind of way that happens when something clicks, when a guest drops a quiet detail that suddenly reframes an entire conversation. For Joe Rogan and much of his audience, this wasn't just another ancient relic. It was something that didn't quite fit the puzzle we thought we understood. The historian went on to explain that Mount Arbel found how it was preserved in wax, dated to the 1st century, and written in Aramaic, not Greek or Latin. Joe kept circling back to one core idea. We've got thousands of pages written about Jesus, but this would be something written by him? That changes the game. It's important to understand the tone here. Joe wasn't declaring a conspiracy or making bold claims. He wasn't trying to stir up outrage or push a narrative. If anything, his reaction was very Joe. Curious, skeptical, open, and that's what made it resonate. Because what he was really reacting to wasn't just the discovery, it was the silence that surrounded it. Why had no one mentioned this possibility before? Why wasn't the idea of Jesus writing something even privately ever part of how we learned about him? The guest pointed out that historically, Jesus has been viewed through oral tradition. His words were spoken, not written. That's how the early Gospels frame him. But this finds, if authentic, complicates that. It suggests that Jesus may have written something down, not for the masses, but for someone close. That small twist opens a much bigger question. What else might have been written and lost? Joe, as expected, didn't let that idea go easily. He brought up the Gospel of Thomas, the once-suppressed text that some scholars claim contains authentic sayings of Jesus, but was left out of the canonical Bible. He also mentioned the Gospel of Mary and other so-called Gnostic writings.
And he says, the earliest gospel, Mark, has this very Jewish Jesus
that were discovered centuries later, often hidden or buried, not to promote a theory, but to make a broader point. History isn't always what we think it is, especially when it's filtered through power structures and institutions. Still, Joe didn't frame this discovery as proof of suppression. He asked thoughtful questions. What if it just got lost in time? What if it wasn't hidden, just overlooked? His guest agreed. That's the real mystery. This scroll might not have been deliberately buried or erased. It might have simply survived by accident, sealed in wax, untouched for 2,000 years, waiting in silence. What hit home for Joe and his audience wasn't just the content of the letter. It was the idea that history can still surprise us, that something so small, a single scroll, a single moment of handwriting, could make us stop and rethink everything we thought we knew. That's what JRE has always done best. It doesn't push conclusions. It lets conversations breathe. And this one? It left room for wonder, for respect, for the unsettling idea that sometimes the past isn't done talking. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Not whether the letter is authentic, but that it even exists. That opened a space, even for a few minutes, where Joe and millions of listeners sat quietly and asked, what if? Was it really meant to be found? When something is buried deep inside a cave, sealed with wax, and hidden among rocks that haven't been disturbed for 2,000 years, it's hard not to ask the obvious. Was this letter ever supposed to see the light of day? That's the question many scholars are quietly asking about the recently uncovered Aramaic letter near Mount Arbel, allegedly written by Jesus to his brother James. Unlike many ancient scrolls and letters meant for circulation or public teaching, this document had a different feel. From the way it was stored, folded tightly, wrapped in a cloth, and sealed with natural wax, it looked more like something someone wanted to protect, not proclaim, not for crowds, not for scribes, maybe not even for history. Dr. Elias Carman, a historian specializing in Judean burial practices, remarked in a JRE podcast follow-up interview, "This wasn't just hidden, it was entombed. The placement and preservation suggest intentional secrecy, like someone didn't just want to keep it safe, they wanted it forgotten. But why?" One theory gaining quiet traction is that this was a deeply personal farewell, a message penned in the final days of Jesus' life. Written not by a preacher addressing the multitudes, but by a man who knew what was coming and wanted to leave behind a piece of himself for the one person he trusted most. The phrasing throughout the letter, according to translation fragments, is strikingly unmessianic. There are no proclamations of divinity, no parables, no commands, just raw language, tired, resigned, still full of hope, but clearly burdened. Lines like, "Hold fast when the darkness gathers, and what I could not speak, I leave with you in silence," feel less like teachings and more like confessions. This wasn't a sermon, it was a whisper. That emotional tone is what's resonating with researchers the most. Not what the letter says in terms of doctrine, but what it feels like. Because if this is real, and scholars admit the carbon dating and linguistic structure are compelling, then we're not just reading words from history. We're reading something Jesus never wanted read by anyone but his brother. And that's where the existential weight kicks in. What else might be out there? How many more fragments, sealed thoughts, or quiet truths have been buried not because they were heretical or dangerous, but because they were private? And if they ever do surface, do we even have the right to read them? It's a strange moral line. When we uncover the ancient thoughts of kings, prophets, or philosophers, we usually celebrate. But when we uncover something this personal, something that was never copied or shared, we feel something else. Almost like we're intruding. Joe Rogan even touched on this during his episode, saying, "It's kind of like reading someone's journal, like if someone had a secret notebook and it ends up on the front page. It's heavy, man." That heaviness is what gives this chapter of the story so much depth. It's not about religious debate. It's about mystery, timing, and the weight of knowing something that was maybe meant to stay unknown. Whether it was hidden out of fear, respect, or pure chance, one thing's for sure. This letter wasn't waiting to be found. It was tucked away, quietly, as if it needed rest as much as the man who wrote it. And yet here it is, unsealed, translated, discussed, and now part of history, whether we were meant to read it or not. A message lost in time, or meant for now. Sometimes what we find says as much about when we find it as what it actually is. A 2,000-year-old letter sealed in wax, buried in a cave, and possibly written by Jesus would have always been newsworthy. But the fact that it's surfaced now, in a time of global uncertainty, social unrest, and deep spiritual questioning, feels almost deliberate, like the timing itself is part of the mystery. Of course, historians and archaeologists tend to dismiss that kind of thinking. They deal in carbon dates and sediment layers, not symbolism. Yet even some of them are quietly acknowledging how strange this moment is. Dr. Leora Safran, a cultural historian who studied the document, told the Jerusalem Archaeological Review, "We're not saying this was meant to emerge now, but the themes it touches, the personal tone, the timing, they resonate deeply in today's world. It's hard to ignore, because this isn't a bombshell revelation or a lost gospel designed to shake religious foundations. It's not the kind of discovery that claims to rewrite history. It's smaller than that, quieter, more personal. And maybe that's exactly why it matters. Unlike the public teachings of Jesus often told in parables, performed among crowds, this letter is stripped of performance. There's no audience, just a voice, private, reflective, and deeply human. If it is truly from Jesus, it's not the image of the man standing on mountaintops or flipping tables in temples. It's the version sitting alone in thought, writing not as a Messiah, but as a man, a son, a brother. And maybe that's why the letter has stirred so much conversation. not only among theologians and scholars, but regular people tuning in through podcasts and online discussions. Because while some are caught up in whether or not it's authentic, others, especially those who listen to the JRE discussion, are focused on something else entirely: what the letter makes us feel. The phrasing in the letter, as referenced in translations, speaks of endurance, of holding on in moments of fear, of speaking softly when the world demands noise. One line in particular has struck a chord with many. The light will seem to leave you, but it is not gone. It waits, patient, beyond the turning. To some, it reads like a metaphor, to others, prophecy. But to almost everyone, it feels oddly relevant. Joe Rogan himself commented on the strange synchronicity during his episode, saying, "It's wild that something this gentle, this intimate shows up now. When everything's loud and divided and spinning out, here's this little voice from the past, just reminding us to slow down." Skeptics, of course, have raised fair questions. Could this be an elaborate forgery? A misattributed document from another early believer? Sure, that debate will go on, but even many of them agree. If this is genuine, then it adds dimension to how we understand Jesus, not as a mythic figure, but as a human being who, at the edge of his own life, chose to write something simple, something real, something honest. And perhaps that's what makes this moment so profound. Not that we've uncovered a secret teaching or a new revelation, but we've heard something ancient that still speaks to us now. Because sometimes it's not about whether something was meant to be found. It's about what it stirs in us once it is. And maybe, just maybe, the real message isn't in the words written long ago. It's in how we carry them forward now. Maybe it was never meant to be found. Or maybe it survived all this time for a reason. A letter, sealed in wax, tucked away in a cave, never shouted its message. It whispered, not to the masses, but to someone Jesus trusted, his brother. And now, 2,000 years later, that whisper has reached all of us. Joe Rogan said it best. That's terrifying, but also kind of beautiful. Because whether you see this as divine intervention, a historical fluke, or something in between, some messages seem to echo louder the longer they wait. And maybe that's the real question now. Was this the voice of Jesus, quietly preserved in time? Or just another ancient mystery, daring us to listen more closely? If Jesus did write just one letter, what do you think he'd want to say? Let us know what you believe in the comments, because sometimes the past doesn't just speak, it waits.